Yeah, let me hold. So this is what it looks like, guys, and the copies are back on the left-hand side back there, so when you leave, everybody take a copy. So I think I'm gonna pray and open up now, so when Richard comes, Richard's here. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah. Well, welcome. Welcome to Warren, Arizona.
Well, thank you. I'm actually in Destin, Florida today with a bunch of grandkids and a bunch of adult children. So I'm tucked away in the quietest place I can find, and hope that works out okay.
So you're slacking off, huh?
Yeah. I'm breaking my vacation fast here to come and drop in on you guys.
Well, thank you. We appreciate that. Let me just say real quick, and then we'll get to our master here. Father, we just thank you again for Richard. We thank you for the study and each and every person in it, their families. And Lord, I just pray that as we start this year, that this year be one of the best years that we've ever had in Marketplace. And then your word will just pierce my heart and everybody's heart in here to the point that we will take some action. And we will tell other people about Jesus, about you. Lord, that's what we're here for. And looking around this room, most all of us are in the last chapter of our life. And I just pray, Lord, that we go out in glory, that we go out in celebrating you, so others can see you through us, because we are your hands and feet. And I just pray for Richard today as he comes and gives us your word. We just ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, Richard, it's all yours.
All right. Well, I hope you guys had a great summer. And as Dave prayed, that I do really pray that this fall and this coming year will be an unusual one. I think we need to always be praying for a better year than the year before. We should always be expecting more from God than what we saw before. Of course, God's always capable of doing anything he wants, but the limiting factor is never God. The limiting factor is always us. How much will we believe him for? How willing are we to obey him when he asks us to do things that we think perhaps are impossible? And so in the spring, I was walking you through Luke chapter 9, and I thought it would just be good for a couple of sessions just to be walking next to Jesus. And as I've said with you before, being a disciple of Jesus doesn't mean that you just believe in Jesus. It means that you follow him. If you're not following Jesus, you're not a disciple. You're a casual believer. You might adopt his worldview, but a true disciple is someone who goes with Jesus. And so I wanted us just to see what it was like for the disciples when they spent time with Jesus, because a lot of their learning, of course, never happened in a Bible study setting like this, or a school classroom, or a seminary classroom. They learned while they followed him, and they encountered life, and then Jesus would help them make sense of what was going on in their life, and the teaching came right out of what they were experiencing, and that's what made it so powerful. And so we were in Luke chapter 9. I think we left off around verse 36 last time. So a lot of transfiguration and that mountaintop experience. And so I want to just pick up in verse 37 and just carry on. And so Luke 9, beginning verse 37, it says the next day. And of course, anytime you pick up somewhere and it starts off by saying the next day, you have to look up a couple verses and say, well, what was the previous day? What happened before that? And of course, right before that, Jesus had taken 3 of his disciples up onto the mountaintop, and they had encountered God the Father. They had seen God the Son transfigured. They had seen Moses and Elijah communing with Jesus. I mean, you talk about a mountaintop experience, it doesn't get much better than that. And so they'd had this wonderful mountaintop experience, And the great temptation for so many of us is we long for the mountaintop experiences. Whether it's a Bible study that God seems to always speak to us in, Sunday morning services, maybe it's an annual conference we go to, but we long for those mountaintop experiences. And some of us can get kind of discouraged when we're not in the middle of one of those. For some people, ordinary life is not that attractive. We just want to stay on the mountaintop. That's kind of what Peter said, right? He was having such a good time. He said, let's just build some tents here and I'll stay here. But there's always a next day. And so it doesn't matter how great your quiet time was, doesn't matter how great that worship service was, your life was gonna have the same description the next day. And it says, when they came down from the mountain. And you've all been there, where you thought, boy, I tell you, if my Christian life could just always be right here. I after going to that Christian conference, I don't know if it was possible to get closer to Jesus. If I could just stay here in this conference setting and have that speaker teach the Bible every day, life would be so good. It'd be like heaven on earth. But there's always the next day, and there's always that moment where we come down from the mountain. And there's been a lot of discussion about whether the Christian life is meant to be a continuous mountaintop experience. Should you feel guilty if you're not feeling that you're on the mountaintop right now, that you're in the valley? And I would suggest that life is not intended to be spent on the mountaintop. It's meant to be spent in the valley, on ground level. The mountaintop experiences are to equip you for your real calling. Christians are not called to pull themselves away together on a mountain somewhere and just enjoy fellowship. Mountaintops are important, but God has a purpose for them. And I would say even this Bible study that you guys go to, that's not the end. That's the means, right? This isn't supposed to be just what you live for all week. This is for you to pick up what you're going to need to know from God's word for the assignments he has for you for the rest of this week. This is equipping. This isn't the end destination. So yeah, these three disciples at least had an incredible mountaintop experience. But at some point, inevitably, we come down the mountain, and it says, when they came down, a large crowd met him. And that was pretty typical of Jesus. I know, he kept trying to get away to spend time with his Father, but every solitary time he came back off the mountain, from out of the wilderness, there was always a crowd of people. And I've had a lot of leaders who felt like, I could get a lot of work done if it just wasn't for all the people. I've known pastors who felt that way. Ministry would be great. I think Richard Nixon said that about the presidency. He said, it'd be great being the U.S. president if it just wasn't for all the people you had to deal with. But when you're a leader, when you're a servant of God, the people are the mission. They are the work. That ought to be the focus. Never get discouraged when God puts people in your life. They are what are eternal. If you find that, I think it was Henry Nouwen who said, for years I complained that my work kept being distracted. I kept being so many distractions from my work. And he said, and then finally one day I realized the distractions were my work. And so, yeah, you could say I've had this worshipful time. I hate for all these people to disturb it, pull me back down into the mundane of ordinary living, but that's where we're called to live. And so they come back down right away. People are clamoring for Jesus' attention. Can you imagine? He's just been communing with God the Father. Elijah and Moses are personally encouraging him. And the next thing you know, he's approaching this crowd and everybody's shouting for his attention and running up and trying to get in front of him and get his, attention so they can get what they want from him. And there's Pharisees shouting criticism at him because as it we'll find out, 9 of his disciples have just failed to set one little boy free. And so there's all kinds of stuff going on. If I were Jesus, I think I would have wanted to just around and go back up the mountain. But instead, he walks into the fray and he starts listening. And it says, verse 38, just then, a man from the crowd cried out, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son because he's my only child." And this is a very interesting story. It's told in all 3 of the synoptic gospels. And I've often thought to myself, here's a crowd of people. Many of them have needs. Many of them have questions for Jesus. But do you notice who it is that he's going to talk to? Like, I'm sure that this man was not the only guy who had a need, maybe even needed healing, maybe had a family member that needed healing. But in this account, this story, there's one person that's going to get it. And I think what we'll see is it's the most desperate person there. It's the person that cries out the loudest. It's the person that is absolutely determined that I'm going to do whatever it takes for Jesus to set my boy free. And so he cries out. Now, I don't know, and there's lots of people crying out. So he had to really be pretty enthusiastic. And it's one of those questions about even prayer that you have to kind of meditate upon. But could God heal? Could God set free every concern that you and I have right now? Well, he could. Certainly has the power. He certainly loves you. But it seems, at least here, that he does give his attention to those most desperate for it, those that are willing to pay whatever price to converse with Jesus and beg him to do what they need him to do. I've shared with you before, but my dad was asked, there's lots of groups praying for revival in America. Do you think we're closer to revival yet? And my dad's response at the time was, well, there's lots of people saying prayers for revival, but I'm not seeing a lot of people crying out to God for it yet, like this man. When you want it that bad, when you pray that fervently, it just seems as if God is pleased. And I sometimes I wonder about the fervency of my prayers, my requests to God. Am I just kind of casually breezing into God's presence with a very sort of lukewarm, half-hearted request, or am I like this father, crying out to God with everything I have, desperately pleading for God's attention to the matter that so consumes me? And so it says, "Teacher," by the way, we've seen this before. It's not always you can't always determine this, but there are times where the 2 main words that typically get used of Jesus, one is teacher or rabbi, and the other is master or Lord. And oftentimes that's a clue as to just how well they know Jesus. The Pharisees never call him Lord. They're always rabbi, teacher. Sometimes his disciples call him teacher. Sometimes they call him Lord. Here, of course, Lord is a much more exalted term. It means you see him as God. Oftentimes is what that means. But here he's saying teacher. So you might say, I mean, he's not like his faith is all that it should be. He's simply taking what he knows and who he is at the moment, and with everything he has, he's crying out to God. And he's not even, I don't know if he knows that Jesus is the Son of God. He just knows he's got power to heal, and that's all that matters to him. Is if you can heal my son, then I'm going to cry out. And I think in part what that says to me is, for God to answer your prayers, you don't have to necessarily be a pristine theologian. You don't have to have 3 years of seminary. You just have to have a heart that's desperate for God to work. You may not have all the answers, but you just know enough to know who to come to when you really desperately need something special to happen. And so he says, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son because he's my only child." Now, of course, in biblical theology, typically, if God looked at you, in other words, if God saw you, if he turned his focus upon you, that typically meant he was going to do something. But there was sort of a theology that, of course, if you sin, that's why Numbers 6 is such a powerful prayer at the end of that, where the priest would pray, may the Lord shine his face upon you. When he shone his face upon you, that meant he looked at you. That meant he gazed upon you. That meant he smiled upon your life. And when he did that, you knew that whatever you needed, he was going to give you. That was the prayer the priest prayed on God's people all the time. And so there was always a sense, in one sense, you knew that God was always aware of what was happening. But when God chose to look upon you, that meant something was going to happen. Once God gave his attention, you knew that he wasn't going to leave until he had done what needed to be done. And so he says, just look at my son. And then he says, because he's my only child. Now, the other Mark and Matthew don't mention he's his only child. But that adds extra, Luke kind of adds that extra little detail that makes it all the more compelling. This man's only got one child, and the one child he has an evil spirit. And he goes on to say, a spirit seizes him. Suddenly he shrieks, and it throws him into convulsions until he foams at the mouth, severely bruising him. It scarcely ever leaves him. Now, this sounds a lot in medical terms like epilepsy, like he's having seizures, but and of course, a lot of times in these days, if you had something like epilepsy, you would have viewed it as a spirit coming upon them. But as it carries on, and this account is going to mention a demon. So it may well have been that it was some evil spirit of some kind that possessed or oppressed this little boy in such a way that it was very similar to convulsions, that suddenly he would just shriek and be thrown to the ground. And I think in some of the other Gospels, it says that he never knew if he'd fall into the water, fall into the fire. So if you could imagine, you're the father, you have no idea what's going on with your son, but you might be just making dinner by the fire, and all of a sudden your little boy just shrieks and starts flailing about and rolling about toward the fire, or rolling down into the water where he would be drowned. It's almost as if some evil force is trying desperately to destroy the only child you have. And you can imagine it could have happened in the middle of the night. You can imagine just the household all sleeping in the modest little house, and then suddenly in the midst of the night, you hear your child suddenly shrieking and thrashing about and foaming at the mouth, and you getting up and trying to, and no matter what you do, you can't seem to settle that child down. Imagine that this has been going on for years. It says the spirit rarely left him. He was almost continuously plagued by this evil spirit. And try to imagine what that must have been like for that father. Clearly, he's at the point of desperation. It doesn't tell us, but we can, I think, safely assume he's tried every medical remedy that's available. He's done everything he knows to do. Certainly, he's prayed to God, and nothing has changed it. And I think you and I, none of us need to speculate very long before we can think of many parents right now desperate for a child, perhaps addicted to drugs, maybe a prodigal, a child that maybe was raised in the church, and it's as if an evil spirit is just luring them to their destruction, living in an ungodly way, listening to the wrong counselors and friends. And I suppose of all the things in all my travels, when people come and share with me what burdens their heart, certainly more than probably anything else, it's one of their children. As if evil has come after their child. And I'll tell you, I don't think I'm telling you anything you don't know, that it seems clear that there are evil forces today that want to destroy the younger generation, to lie to them, to confuse them, to put them into bondage with lies, with deception, with falsehood. The spirit of this age is alive and well, and it hates our children. It hates our grandchildren. And I would say we need to be like this father, pleading for God's focus and attention upon those that God's put in our care and our concern. And so this father pleads, and he tells him how bad it is. And then the tragic thing in verse 40, it says, I begged your disciples. He didn't just ask them. He begged, and of course, there's 9. Jesus has 3 of his disciples with him on the Mount of Transfiguration. The 9 that didn't get taken, he begs them. We don't know if the man begged all 9 one by one, if he begged them as a group, but he clearly recognized, those are some of Jesus' disciples. I've heard that they have power to heal people, and he rushes up to them. He begs them to drive out this evil spirit, and then those devastating 3 words: but they couldn't, or but they could not. And though that last little phrase just sort of hangs in the air over the whole conversation, they could not. And I've been burdened often by those words. I've thought to myself, and how many hurting families, how many hurting parents have perhaps taken their family to one of our churches, hoping that getting around God's people, or maybe sending them to a youth group, would help their child resist the lure of drugs, the destructive temptations their kids were succumbing to. And how many times could parents say, we tried going to that church, we tried sending our kids to that church and that youth group, but it didn't help. Maybe the church kids saw our kids as trouble and avoided them. They didn't get involved in their lives, or the church was happy for us to come sit in some empty chairs, but it didn't walk with us. It didn't pray for us. It didn't believe on our behalf. Those devastating words, because if there's any people that ought to be a source of healing and deliverance, it ought to be God's people. And this man had enough sense to come to the followers of Jesus, help. And then that devastating phrase, but they couldn't. They didn't have the power. And you know, I mean, if we don't know what comes next, we might say, well, you know, not every maybe God doesn't want everybody to be healed. Maybe, you know, some cases are just a lot more difficult. You can't expect to, you know, be successful all the time. We could make a lot of different assumptions about why those disciples couldn't set the boy free. Some have I mean, it's pretty, we don't know enough. You know, a lot of people have asked, well, why didn't Jesus just take all 12 disciples up on the Mount of Transfiguration? Were those 3 somehow more believing, more spiritual, more faithful? There's no way. Just because he takes 3 doesn't mean they were the godliest of the 12. The 9 that got, because of course they can't be that godly because they fell asleep while Jesus is meeting with Moses and Elijah and God the Father. So they're not like they're super spiritual themselves. They had their own failure on the mountaintop. But the other 9, all 9 of them, not one of them, apparently has the faith, the walk with God to help set this man's little boy free. And so then you get to the next verse, and verse 41 may well be one of the harshest rebukes to come from the mouth of Jesus. He replied, you unbelieving and perverse generation, how long will I be with you and put up with you? Now that does not sound that. Now I'll tell you, when you see words like that coming out of the mouth of Jesus, he doesn't even talk that way to Pharisees very often. How long will I be with you? You perverse generation, unbelieving generation. Those are harsh words. And I'll just tell you, and it just seems almost uncharacteristic of Jesus. He doesn't talk this way very often. And so when you see Jesus that agitated, if you will. You have to stop, and you have to camp there and say, so what would make Jesus that upset? What would make Jesus speak that harshly? How long do I have to be with you, put up with you? That's and of course he's been talking to this father, but I mean, he'd never seen this father before. He'd not been with him before. It's not like he's been with him a long time. And we don't even know that he's a believer, that he's certainly not one of the 12 disciples. So, you know, it may be that he's looking at the Father. It's in it's Mark's gospel that when he kind of challenges the Father replies, you know, I do believe, help in my unbelief. That famous phrase there in the Gospel of Mark. But it might be that Jesus looked at the whole crowd and just, you know, it just seemed like no matter how much he taught, this crowd never got it to have faith in God. Maybe he's rebuking the whole group, just saying you're all this way, not just the Father. I've always felt like, though, he was probably looking at those 9 disciples, because the man just points to the 9 and says, I begged them to set my boy free, but they could not. And I can see all 9 of those disciples with their heads lowered, their eyes turned away. Nobody wants to look at Jesus and realize and confess the fact 9 of us couldn't set one little boy free today. And of course, what's puzzling about that is that if you go back to the beginning of the chapter, chapter 9, the very first verse, it says, summoning the 12, he gave them power and authority over all the demons and to heal diseases. So at the beginning of this chapter, Jesus has given those disciples all the power and authority necessary to have set that little boy free. So how could God give them all the power they needed, all the authority, and then just within the same chapter, they can't even set a little boy free? Where did power go? And the question that I would have for each of us is, how much power has God made available to you and me? In the Great Commission, he said, all power and authority has been given to me. You go, therefore, make disciples, and so on. But are there times when we don't seem to have that power? Are there times when we meet defeat as we're trying to help people? When we pray and ask God to work and heaven remains silent? Where does the power go? And that's a huge question here, because, and I think that's part of why Jesus is so upset, because when we lose the power of God in our life, it doesn't just harm us. Other people pay the price when we don't have God's power active and working in our life. And that's why we can't afford not to have. And there have been times in my life where I was trying to help someone, or I was counseling someone, trying to just maybe talk to someone after a conference where I was speaking. And it's clear this person's hurting and agitated. And there have been times when I've shared truth from God's word, and boy, their countenance changed and they glowed and they thanked me, and they believed God had really given them a word that set them free. And there's other times where I just feel like nothing happened. And there are times I walk away and I wonder, where did the power go? This person clearly needed a work of God in their life. They came to me and I gave them what I had. It just wasn't enough. Does the power of God ebb and flow in our life? And what can we do to prevent? Now, the Bible doesn't now. In Matthew's gospel, in this same account, chapter 17, that once it's all done, the disciples come to Jesus and they ask him, why could we not heal that boy? And Jesus says, well, because of your unbelief. Because if you believed, then you could say to this mountain, move here, and it would move. Nothing would be impossible to you. And there's also some kind of verses that aren't in all the manuscripts, but in that account where Jesus says, but this kind only comes with prayer and fasting. And so it might be that I think maybe what Jesus was saying in Matthew was, this is a hard one. This was a tough demon. That doesn't mean it was impossible. I'm not letting you off the hook. I'm just telling you this required prayer and fasting, and you weren't willing to pay the price necessary to see the power of God work in their life. And I just personally believe part of why Jesus gets so upset here is because Jesus said, to whom much is given, much is required, much is expected. And nobody had been given more than those 12 disciples. At the beginning of this chapter, they were given much. They were given power and authority. And so Jesus is saying, with all that you've been given, don't just blow off encounters where the power of God's not evident in your life. Don't just excuse days of prayer where you're praying, but God's not answering, where you are trying to have victory, but there's no power for victory. Don't just walk away. Stop and be held accountable for the powerlessness in your life right now. And I'm just speculating, but I kind of feel like those, I don't know how it came down. The Bible doesn't tell us. I'm guessing that when this father came running up, begging those 9 disciples to free his son, one of the disciples, maybe Thomas, stepped up and said to the other 8 disciples with him, hey, guys, this is a little boy. This shouldn't take much. Just a week ago, I cast out a demon from a grown man. That won't take all 9 of us to set this little boy free. And he did whatever he normally did to cast out evil spirits, and nothing happened. And maybe Andrew stepped up, said, Thomas, your problem is you're always doubting. Let me show you what I do, because just last week I cast out 2 demons, this always works for me. But maybe all 9 tried to cast out that demon, and they all failed. And so at some point, those disciples gave up. At some point, they turned to that father and said, sir, we're sorry, but your son's case is impossible. Sir, we did the best that we could, and it wasn't enough. By the way, we're not called to give people our best. We're called to give people God's best. And the disciples' best clearly wasn't sufficient. But that's all that they had to give that. They didn't have God's best. If they had, the boy would have been set free. And at some point, I think these disciples just kind of were ready to move on. And what tells me that is that when Jesus arrives, you would have thought one of the 9 disciples would have run up to Jesus and said, hey, Jesus, I'm glad you got here. Listen, we got a really tough case today. We've been doing all we know to do, and we haven't had success yet, but hey, we told this father, don't go anywhere, because when Jesus gets here, we know he can set your boy free. But they didn't say anything, right? They're conspicuously silent when Jesus arrives. It's the father who has to tell the whole story. The disciples don't do that, because the disciples don't look very good in the story. I think the disciples were just ready to move on. I think the disciples were probably thinking to themselves, hey, it's been a bad day, but we've had success before. We'll probably have success again. But on this day, this town, maybe they're just kind of resistant to the gospel. Maybe this father has sin in his life. Maybe this little boy really didn't want to be set free. But tomorrow's another day. Let's move on. And I almost feel like that's part of the anger that comes out of Jesus. He's looking at these disciples with their bags packed, ready to move to the next village. And he's saying, you're just going to leave? You're just going to walk away? This little boy on the ground, thrashing about with an evil spirit, and you're just going to walk away and say, we did the best we could? And I think that's why he's so harsh with them. Folks, whenever you give up on someone, I don't care how powerful you claim you believe God is. You've just declared God's not all powerful. With God, not all things are possible. This isn't possible. That person is never going to change. I've tried for years, and They're still the same. I prayed for years and they're still the same. Jesus was, I think, chastising disciples who give up on people and say that's impossible. America will never change. My state will never change. My family will never change. And by the way, what's interesting to me, and again, you just have to kind of connect the dots, but the question for me is, so where did this power go? Because we see in the beginning of the chapter that Jesus had given them all power and authority, but then all of a sudden they don't have it anymore. And it's just interesting to me that if you follow this story, we'll just jump ahead for a moment here. If you go down to verse 46, it's after this incident. Now they're moving on. Now they're walking down the road to their next assignment. It's basically, once this embarrassing failure is done, then the disciples, okay, now they're moving on. And so verse 46 says, an argument started among them about who was the greatest of them. Now, what strikes you interesting about that? Like, they've just come, I mean, Jesus has just said to 9 of them, you unbelieving, perverted generation, how long must I put up with you? Now, how should they have been acting after? By the way, see, I'm wondering, maybe those 3 disciples that were up on the mountaintop, maybe they're snickering at the other 9, saying, no wonder we got brought up on the mountain and you weren't brought up. You guys can't even set free a little boy. And maybe word had gotten out among the 9. Maybe they said, you guys can't even stay awake when God is calling a special divine meeting and you're slumbering. Well, I wouldn't have slept if I was there. And the 12, they all be arguing about who's the most spiritual, most godly, after all 12 of them had just failed. All 12 of them had let Jesus down. Now, remember what the Gospels say about how do you know what's in a person's heart? Well, listen to what comes out of their mouth. And what's coming out of their mouth is pride. They're all boasting. They're all comparing. And now, after they all had failed, they should all be voicing words of humility, not pride, right? They should have all been remorseful to say, oh, God, help us. Because I was spiritually careless in my walk with God, that little boy almost wasn't healed. He might have spent all of his days under the torment of that evil spirit. God, help me never to get careless, never to get casual in my walk with God. Instead, pride has already filled them after they've been rebuked by Jesus and failed even to help a little boy. And I think that that's probably where the power went. You can't have God's power and pride in your life at the same time. The moment pride enters your life, the power of God leaves your life. And I think that's why God had made power available to them. God's not going to empower someone who's filled with pride. It just doesn't go together. Because then, of course, you take all the credit for the power of God, and God will not let you touch his glory. He's very jealous of his glory. And prideful people, if they had the power of God, would just be too tempted to take the credit for what was happening. And so the power is gone. And because of their pride. And again, I've had to say, Lord, by the way, I know grandparents deeply burdened for a grandchild or a child. And yet many of them won't ask any of their friends to pray for their child or grandchild. And you know why? Because of pride. Because they don't want anyone to know they've got a child or a grandchild who's struggling, maybe battling with drugs. Well, I'll never forget one time, I had a deacon in my church when I was a pastor. He came to me and he told me that he had a child that was struggling and would I pray for him? And I was a young pastor, I guess didn't know any better, but I saw 2 other deacons shortly after, and I didn't give all the details. I just said, hey, our brother Garrett is just concerned about one of his kids. We need to be praying for him, walking with him. I thought that was a safe thing. But the next thing I knew, Garrett comes charging back in my office angry, red-faced, and saying, "Why did you tell those men about my child?" I said, "Well, I didn't give any details. I just said we need to be praying for your family right now." Well, that's none of their business. That's I didn't want everybody to know that I had a struggling child. I just told you. I thought to myself, if I had a struggling child, I'd be shouting it from the rooftops. People, just help me. I don't want to carry this alone. I want my pride to ever get in the way of what God might do in my child's life. So the more people praying, the better. More people trusting God, the better. More people walking alongside my child, the better. But oftentimes pride will cause us to, it will cancel out what the power of God might have done had we just humbled ourselves and said, God, I just want to beg you, whatever it takes, help my child. And so that's the last thing just to point out in this story. It said, as the boy was, in verse 42, as the boy was still approaching, the demon knocked him down and threw him into severe convulsions. And I don't know why the demon, now he's in the presence of Jesus, clearly he knows he's in trouble. I mean, every time you see a demon in the Gospels confronted by Jesus, they're always agitated because they always know. In fact, I don't know what, we may look at this sometime, but sometimes it's clear that the demons fear that they will be cast into the abyss. And they'll say, don't, like when the demons, the legion, when they say, don't cast us into the abyss, cast us into those pigs. And it seems as if there is a place, you can call it the abyss. It's like a holding tank for demons. It's before they're thrown in the final judgment in the lake of fire. There's some kind of prison. And it's a place demons don't want to go. And so whenever they're in the presence of Jesus, they're terrified of what he's going to do to them. And so this demon obviously is agitated. But you'd think he'd be focused more on Jesus than the boy at that point. But it's almost as if this demon is like, to the last minute, he's going to bring all the destruction he can upon this child's life. He knows he may not be around much longer to torment the boy, but to the last second, he wants to make his life as miserable as possible. And I want you to know there's nothing kind, gentle about the powers of evil. They hate you, they hate your family, and to the last breath they have, they're going to do whatever they can to bring harm to you and your family. And so to the very last second, he's agitating and harming this child. And it says, but Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And then just notice this last phrase, and then I'll just stop, see if you have any questions or comments. It says, in verse 43, it says, and they were all astonished at the greatness of God. Now, I think that's interesting, that phrase, because, of course, the people don't know that Jesus at that point is God. You'd think it would have said they were all astonished at the power, at the greatness of Jesus, right? Jesus is the one who's just set the boy free. But here it says everybody's astonished at the greatness of God. Now, what's the difference between the disciples and Jesus at this point? The disciples actually failed, and they still want credit. They still want people's recognition. Their pride is so tenacious that even after they fail, they're still bragging about how good they are. And they want the focus to be on them. Jesus does what was impossible for anyone else to do, but he does it in such a way that when he's done working, everybody's amazed at his heavenly Father. And I've thought to myself, now, how can I serve God in such a way that after people have encountered me, they don't come away impressed with Richard Blackaby. They come impressed with Richard Blackaby's God. And of course, I wrote a book, it came out in April, called The Ways of God. And the reason it's so important to do things God's way is because God's way always brings glory to God. The world's way will bring glory to you. That's why God cares about the way you do something. You can do the right thing and do it the wrong way. And if you do it the wrong way, people will think more highly of you, but not of your God. Jesus does this incredible miracle, and everyone is talking about his God afterward. And so I've had to ask myself, so God, that's how I want to live. I want to live in such a way it doesn't build my reputation, it builds yours. It makes people think more of you. And so that storyline ends, and I'm glad that the Gospels tell stories of failure, because I can identify with those. I've got plenty of my own that I've experienced over the years. And I'm grateful that if Jesus is rebuking his own disciples, perverse and faithless generation, I'm grateful that you can mess up that badly and God doesn't give up on you. He still works in your life. And those same disciples that were rebuked so harshly, before long, they'll be turning the world upside down, because they will experience the power of God. They will learn to humble themselves and allow God to do his powerful work through their life. So let me just stop there in case there's lots there to consider. And I think primarily the question is that we have to take an inventory of is, am I experiencing the mighty power in my life? And if I'm not, where has the power gone? Because it seems clear that if you're a disciple of Jesus, that he wants to give you all power and authority. I don't think that's just for the 12 apostles. I think that's for that's for the followers of Jesus. As you do Jesus' work, you'll have his power and authority. And if I'm not experiencing that, I don't want to spend another day. The 12 disciples, until they get rebuked, until Jesus intervenes, it looks like they're content just to keep on being powerless disciples, just kind of walk away and say we did the best we could. After Jesus intervenes and shows that it is possible to set that boy free, had you believed, then that starts them on a journey of saying, well, then how do we get that power back, and how do we keep that power? And I think that's just a great question for us to ask ourselves. Right now, as I'm living and relating to people, am I experiencing the power of God in my prayers, in my interactions with others, my witness, in the way I just talk with other people? Does God's power flow through me? Or has it been short-circuited somehow? Maybe it's been pride that has crept in my life. Maybe it's something else. And it's costing other people for me to not get my with God back to where it ought to be. I don't want to walk away from people that God would have set free had I only been walking with God the way that I should have been. All I can do is make sure that I'm a conduit through which God is pleased to work powerfully in any way he wants to. But that part, that's my responsibility. Make sure my life is such that God, there's no hindrance in my life for the power of God. Well, let me stop there and just see, are there any questions or comments about that this morning?
Richard, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Your question, where did the power go?
Yeah.
The power always there. It's just that pride kind of filters into the faith that the ministry, so it couldn't actually work. It's not maybe a very good example, but I'm just trying to understand. You said, where did the power go? The power never really left. It didn't go anywhere. It's always there. I guess that's a question.
Yeah, and of course because God is present, so it's like, you could also just use the analogy of power in an outlet. Like there's times I'm working on my laptop and all of a sudden I get a warning, my battery is about dead. I think, wait a minute, I thought my laptop was plugged in the wall. And I look and it's been yanked out. It's not all the way in. It's not getting power. The cord's stuck kind of toward the wall, but it's not pushed in far enough. And so it gave me the appearance of being plugged in when it really wasn't. And so, where did the power go? Well, the power has always been there. I'm just not plugged into it properly. And the moment I go and I push the plug all the way securely into the plug-in, suddenly everything lights up again, the power's there, but that it can be deceiving because, you know, I'm looking over that cord and I'm assuming all's well. And if I look carefully, if I looked up at the top of my laptop, it would tell me I'm on battery power right now, not plug-in power. But I don't often pay attention at the time until something goes wrong. And then all of a sudden my screen is going blank and I realize, wait a minute, things aren't as good as I thought they were. And that's what happens like for this. The disciples could have been walking along with Jesus for days and not realize that the power wasn't there in their life anymore. But when they faced a crisis, and now that's when it exposes the powerlessness of their life. And I think sometimes that's why God lets us face challenges like that, just to help us kind of measure, to see the power that's in our life at the moment or not. But yeah, but Dave, you're right. The power is always there. It's just not being accessed in our life at the moment. And I'd rather make sure that I was fully plugged into the power of God before a crisis came. I don't want to be scrambling to get my life back in order in the midst of a crisis.
And the next step of that is the type of faith,
Yeah, do you say the type of faith?
or lack of.
Or lack of faith? Yeah, yeah. Again, all the power in the world it can be available to you, but if you don't believe it, it doesn't matter. God's not, you know, I mean, God's not going to just. It's interesting. I mean, even though the 9 disciples maybe didn't believe, God loved that little boy. So why didn't God just go ahead and heal the boy anyway? He knows he's going to once Jesus gets there. But in Matthew's gospel, Jesus makes it very clear when they ask, why could we not heal that boy? And he nails it. He says, because of your lack of belief. Had you believed, you would have set that boy free. And so anywhere in my life where I'm not seeing victory right now, I'm not seeing the power of God, I want to quickly say, God, then help me in my unbelief. Help me take my belief to the level that you would be pleased. And you know, probably for most of us, if I just kind of went around that room and asked each one of you, there's some things that are easy to believe God for, but then there are inevitably some things that we struggle to believe God for. Some things aren't hard to believe. Some things we've had success for years with. But there's usually something. Maybe it's one prodigal child. Maybe you got 2 kids walking closely with the Lord, but you've got that one that just doesn't, like, anything you do seems to work. Maybe it's a broken relationship, and you've normally been a guy who was really good with people, but this one relationship, you've done everything you know to do, and you can't seem to get it healed. And I don't know why that is sometimes, but those kind of things show you the limit of your faith. You've come to believe God to help you with those kids, but this kid you're about to give up. Say, God, even the power of God cannot turn that child around. And what you've done is you've just seen where the edges of your faith are, and you need to say, God, I've got to take my faith to the level that I can trust you, even for that child, even for that relationship or that problem.
Yeah, Richard. Don. 2 things quickly just hit me. When you first started out, you made the observation that some people lose focus on what their real purpose in life is. It reminded me of a university president in the Midwest, I forget which college, but was on a tour of his campus with an interviewer, and the interviewer said, what a beautiful campus you have here. And the administrator famously said, yeah, it would be a beautiful campus if it wasn't for all the damn students. I think we all kind of understand that, and sometimes, you know, we have the flowers in the right place and buildings in the right place and all these pretty benches, but the damn students mess up the campus. Again, that's always been my famous memory of somebody losing focus on what they're supposed to do. The other thing is, going through my divorce, my kids were terribly affected by it, and my son especially got into trouble, got locked up for a month in jail. Anyway, without getting all the details, but I finally ended up joining a tough love group, and tough love was wonderful. But boy, Self-love is not you're in there with a bunch of parents who are on their last bread. You know, you don't make your first stop self-love. You're trying to help save your child in a situation, and there's some desperate stories I remember out of that group, but some lost their kids while we were in the group, the drug overdose or whatever, and others of us saved our kids. Fortunately, my son able to save, but the point is, you reach a point, and this is what I'm looking for your comment on. You reach a point that you really want to stop and think, is what you're praying for what God wants for you? In other words, it's the old thing, God gives you what you need, not what you want. And sometimes you need to step back and look at the situation in a larger context. And God, again, you know, am I focused on the wrong thing? Is there another, you obviously have a higher ability to know what's right for me than I do. And
yeah. And that's a great point, is that, you know, one of the reasons God may not be giving you what you ask is you don't have the power, the faith to believe it. But the other key reason, it might be you're asking the wrong thing. And God, you're asking for a second best. And God would say, no, I know you believe me, but you also have to align your will with my will. And so those two things I'd always would check. It might be you do believe, it's just you're believing God for the wrong thing. And so you want to get both of those aligned properly. And if you're praying believing and you're praying in alignment with God's will, then that's a powerful prayer. I'm going to bet money that you're going to get an answer when you pray that way.
Richard, it's Richard here. Thank you. We had a conversation a long time ago about that and the way Southerners addressed me. And it always came out wretched, and they were right. But thank you for pride. You know, I was wondering in this whole situation here, you know, I think it was Paul that said, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. Now that says a team effort, collective. And when I engage myself in some of these situations with others, you know, am I going to do it my way? And I think that's been pervasive in our culture and society for many, many decades now. Don't want to let loose, don't want to let anybody else in. And I'm wondering if this issue here, where when Jesus rebuked it, if he hadn't called on the Father first, because he went to his Father any number of times. And we don't do that. You know, I can do this. My whole being is that way. I'm getting much, much too old to be thinking that way at all, but still in all. But thanks for that, because it is pride and ego that keeps me from sometimes seeing the results that God would like us to see.
I think men especially, I think especially for men, it's just hard to admit that we can't do it ourselves. We look at other men, they seem like they've got their act together and their family's doing fine. I don't want to confess that, you know, mine's struggling. And so pride causes not even to ask for help, and even just to get other counsel and advice. I've never understood that when it comes to being a father. Like, you know, when a father knows he's maybe struggling in some area as a father, you'd think they'd be asking for advice all they could from other men, other fathers. But oftentimes we don't. And I just had to get to the point of saying, I love my kids too much to let my pride keep me from getting help and seeking advice, seeking prayer. Lord, just crucify that pride in me and let me be just like this dad that was willing to humble himself and beg for help if it helped one of his kids. And I want to be, you know, hopefully that's how my kids see me. Not that they won't tell you that I was a perfect dad for sure, but hopefully they would say, but dad would do whatever he could to make it right. He'd get whatever help he could to make sure I had what I needed. And if he didn't have it, he humbled himself and found a way to find it. And I think that's really what speaks highly of this man was he couldn't help his son. but he was going to do everything he could to find help from God and humble himself in front of that whole crowd if he had to. But he was going to, as long as his son walked away set free, that's all he cared about.
Humbling himself is tough.
Any more questions?
Just one comment. Guys in this room know Daryl Delhusi, I'm sure. His son Ken was my pastor. Taught me more about praying for people that stuck with me for years. And that is the ability to, what you were saying, humble yourself. But the power is to believe that God can affect whatever you're praying for in that person. But just refining what you said before, when they were given the power at the very first verse there, were they given the power to heal, or were they given, because of their faith, they were given the power to believe in God that he could take care of it? What Kent used to say, used to tell me, is who in the heck are you to say, oh, if I'm going to pray for you and you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to go see this doctor, and you need to straighten up and all that, rather than turning it completely over to God and just sticking with that and building up yourself to be the person in that person's life that God is using you in that situation. That meant more to me than trying to figure out and taking on these burdens, which are society said, well, you're men, you can do this, you're all, rather than turning it completely over to God and just sticking with it. That's it.
Yeah, I think we just have to have the humility to know this isn't my power. This is God's power. It's not my wisdom, but I'm a servant. And I don't want you to ever think this is about me. I'm just depending on God and crying out to him on your behalf. But I think when in verse 1 of that chapter, when he says, I'm giving you all power and authority, I think what he was saying is, I'm equipping you with everything you need to do my will. So you get out there and be a blessing, you be salt and light, and everywhere you go, I will give you whatever you need to successfully do and ask you to do.
That's not separate from God. He doesn't give it to you and then God goes away. That God is giving, well, God to do these things, to pray, how to pray for these things.
Right. And that's why, like in Acts, Jesus says to his disciples, now don't go anywhere yet. Wait until the Spirit has come upon you, because if you go now, you won't have you won't have me. The only power you have is that you've got the Spirit within you to do the work through. And you're foolish to ever think it's your power. You're just a clay vessel that's inhabited by the Spirit of God, and it's the Spirit of God's presence in your life that's where the power comes. That's where it comes from. Yeah, I've never, I don't like that when we talk about having God's authority. We're just an ambassador. We don't have any authority of our own. The only authority we have is that we have a message from God, and it's his authority. He keeps his authority, just like he keeps his power. But he's looking for a vessel, a servant, through whom he can work through, because we're surrendered to him. So our job is to be so surrendered, so trusting, that God sees us and says, that's the kind of instrument I could use, I will use. And so that's all we can do.
Well, thank you, Richard. Go back to the beach now and enjoy the rest of your vacation.
Yeah, it was a little moment of sanity here before going back with 4 kids, 8 and under. But I'll be seeing you guys, I think in November. I'll be out there. So I'll look forward to dropping in person again this fall.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Richard.